we have some new research that's kind of a new bombshell survey from online education platform edX. In it, they find that executives that they polled believe that nearly half of all the skills in today's workforce will not be relevant just 2 years from now, thanks to AI. Now, this survey polled 1,600 full time US based employees, and it included 800 C suite executives and 800 knowledge workers. And among the C suite executives surveyed, they estimated that 49% of all skills that exist in the workforce today won't be relevant by 2025. And they feel that 40%, 47% of their workforce is unprepared for the future of work. Now, some other interesting things that jumped out here: 87% of the C suite said that they were struggling to find AI talent or talent with AI skills. 79% fear that if they don't learn AI, they won't be prepared for the future of work. And interestingly, there's somewhat of a disconnect between some of the answers from the C suite and some from employees in this survey. For instance, 56% of the C suite said they believe executive roles at their company could be, quote, completely or partially replaced by AI, whereas only 20% of employees think that most or all of their role could be automated by AI. Additionally, 58% of employees surveyed say that they're taking steps to adapt to AI, but not that many are using their company's learning and development programs to do so. Now, it's unclear if they're not using their learning and development programs and have them available, or if these don't exist in the first place.
They don't exist, I think you can probably.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Our research would tell us that,
Yeah, I'm
right?
fairly confident that they don't really exist in those
Yes.
companies.
So let's start off here, Paul, by talking about the big finding. Obviously, it's only a single survey. You have to take all these things with a grain of salt. But it is pretty shocking to me to read that like 800 C-suite leaders generally are thinking that like half the skills in their workforce will not be relevant in 24 months. Like, what did you make of this finding?
I agree with that. I mean, the first thing I do when I get to reports like this is I go to the methodology.
Yeah.
Like, who are the people answering these questions? Because there, as we have said before, there's bias in every single research report you're going to read. And so the first thing I think about is, okay, so they've got 800 C-suite, 500 of them are CEOs. Largely based on our experience, most CEOs still have a very baseline at best understanding of AI. So to ask CEOs to project this sort of stuff out is flawed at best. Like they're just not going to know. However, it is what they perceive to be true. So I
Right.
think that do I put a ton of weight in the number you said about the percentage of skills more than half in the current workforce won't be relevant in 24 months? No. Like the number means nothing to me. Like
Mhm.
because it's not accurate. Um that being said, the fact that these CEOs think that is kind of crazy. I don't know what they would base that on, that like more than
Mhm.
half of skills in the current workforce wouldn't be relevant within 2 years. Um, I don't agree with that for one. Um, but I think it's a very fascinating perspective that they do. And I would love to have like a focus group about that question and like dig deeper into it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really good point. I think what's interesting about some of these findings is just whether they are correct or not, directionally showing where people's heads are at, because there is a lot of interesting perspectives on this stuff that are motivating real behavior, whether it's the correct actions or not. So
Right.
I found that pretty interesting. Do you see this kind of disconnect between some of the C-suite answers and the employee answers? It seems like, I mean, again, rightly or wrongly, it seems like leaders are thinking way more aggressively about AI's potential to augment or automate work or roles, much more so than their employees are in this survey.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is like the uncomfortable conversation that we have to keep coming back to. CEOs, especially if these CEOs work for publicly traded companies or private equity backed companies, they have a responsibility to keep costs down. And so right now, a lot of work gets offshored to keep costs down.
Mm.
If they have a way to use AI to achieve the same outcome, they're going to pursue it. And so I think that there's always going to be a disconnect because the objectives are different. Um, the employees aren't thinking about necessarily the same outcomes that the CEOs are charged with thinking about. So the fact that there is a massive discrepancy isn't surprising to me at all because they're just coming at it from a different perspective.
So let's kind of wrap up here talking about that education component. So, what jumped out to me is that only 58% of employees surveyed said they were even taking steps to adapt to AI, which I guess seemed low to me. And we talked about, 24% are using company education to make changes. Can we maybe for listeners contextualize just how little education formally exists out there at these organizations?
Yeah, and keep in mind, like this research is sponsored by edX, so I mean there is a natural desire to create awareness around the gap, but it is a real gap. Like regardless of who sponsored the research,
Hmm.
um, to us it's the biggest gap. I mean, it's always anytime I give a talk, I always start with like, what do you do next? Education and training. Like it is the fundamental thing, and it's because it can't be centralized with a few people. That there has to be wide scale understanding of AI, and I think that overall, I actually thought this was a pretty good research report. Like I thought
Yeah.
a lot of the findings were very valid, and I think that this is one that matters. Like it's the only path forward. Like we can't slow down the technology. We can't on an individual basis really affect whether it's used for good or bad. Like we can go in ourselves pursuing the use of this for good, but really the only thing we have control of at the moment is preparing people. It's
Mm.
AI literacy. It's experimenting with AI, encouraging that culture of experimentation. Um, so yeah, I mean, I thought that was important. There was the couple that like there was one I found just absolutely shocking, and it said 79% of executives predict that entry level knowledge work jobs will no longer exist
Mm.
as AI creates an entirely new suite of roles for employees entering the workforce. I have no idea what the heck they're even saying there. Like 79% said entry level knowledge workers won't exist. So again, you have to like when if you do read this one in full, and I don't, it's a pretty quick read. I mean, you can read it in five
Yeah.
minutes. Just know that like you can't take some of these things as fact or even close to facts. They are just opinions, but some of these opinions are kind of crazy. Um, but it did end up with 79% of executives fear if they don't learn how to use AI, they'll be unprepared for the future of work. That is 100% true.
Yeah.
Um, and then while most executives feel optimistic about how AI will impact them, some feel overwhelmed by the pace of change. I think that is true. And I think the biggest takeaway for me here is just how CEOs are thinking about this. And we don't have a ton of research out there about that. And so I think this is a valuable report just providing that perspective. And I think that last line there, they feel overwhelmed by the pace of change.
Mm.
It is very true. I mean,
Yeah.
we hear that all the time. So and I know a lot of our listeners probably feel that way. Like I've said before, I feel that way sometimes. Like there are
Mhm.
just days and weeks where it's just too much. And so I think this is helpful perspective from the CEO.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a big takeaway for me is related to that here, which is you're really trying to, if you're trying to keep tabs on this stuff and really adapt in a practical way your career or your role to take advantage of AI and kind of, protect yourself and build a competitive advantage, thinking about the differing incentives, depending on if you're a CEO versus an employee, is really, really helpful for you to get ahead of some of these changes and predict where things are going.